Good evening, community. As always, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to bring you the following story. I want to remind you that if you're too sensitive, if you're a person prone to getting upset, always take these as mere entertainment, like a horror movie if you will. Remember that nothing can affect you if you don't believe. Remember that fear is what calls the beings that feed on it, the beings we talk about in Tales of the Night and similar programs. Tonight's story will be quite intense, so we recommend taking it with great caution and not letting small children listen to it, and above all, that no one listens to it alone. My name is Uriel Reyes, and you're already entering the following tales of the night. I had never imagined writing a Tales of the Night story, I swear. I listened to them religiously in those early years, when they sometimes talked about curiosities, horror movies, cursed films, and those creepypastas that gradually disappeared from the channel. To tell the truth, I preferred those. I liked the stories I could take as fiction more than the real ones, which is why I gradually drifted away from the channel, listening more sporadically as the years went by, until around 2018 when I lost track of them after losing my YouTube account. It's not that I didn't believe in everything that can happen. On the contrary, in my family, before I was born, terrible things happened with a woman in black who manifested herself, who materialized in my house, and they say the last time she appeared was approaching my crib when I was just days old. The way this woman marked my family, the horror with which they remember her, has been enough for me to stay away from these stories as much as I can, although they've always made me curious. Recently, Rafa, my husband, downloaded Spotify and gave me an account, and there you were again, like an old friend I was happy to run into. The difference is that now, community, now I have a story to tell you. It happened in Ciudad Juarez. I'm from Chihuahua, from the capital, but when I decided to move in with my now husband, then boyfriend, he suggested we move to the border where he was from, and where we would have more opportunities to start the business we were thinking about. A friend of his had helped him find several housing options, and when he showed them to me, there seemed to be one that was much better than the rest. It even seemed like a joke. There were small houses, in good condition or improvable, and there was a very nice 2-story house with a small yard perfect for a garden. Of course, that's the one I chose. I didn't even worry about the prices because if he had shown it to me, it meant it was within our budget to rent it. The only strange thing was that they asked for several months' rent in advance, non-refundable if you didn't complete the entire contract term in the property. I was very happy when we traveled there, with our few belongings in my dad's truck, with Maximo, my 15-year-old dog, in my arms. When we arrived at the house in Juarez, a couple of Rafa's friends were already waiting for us, who along with him and my dad, quickly unloaded the heaviest furniture. I remember very well how pleased I was when we were entering that street, the private road, and saw it was quiet, peaceful. When I saw that the house was just like in the photos, but I also remember that in that first moment, upon entering it, just crossing the threshold, I felt as if I had been punched in the stomach. Not hard, a punch like the one a child gives you that knocks the wind out of you. But it was very clear. Maximo didn't want to enter, but I attributed it to him wanting to play with Rafa's friends because he loved meeting people and being petted. I had to carry him to show him around the house. They brought everything in, arranged it where it was supposed to go, and we planned to leave it like that, the house half furnished with the little we had brought. My dad stayed to sleep in the master bedroom, which we weren't going to use because it was strange. It faced the backyard and was very dark. We stayed in what would be our room from that moment on, a small one but with a view of the street that seemed to have served as an office. At some point during the night, I noticed that Maximo had gone out. He scratched at the door and Rafa opened it for him. I know I dreamed a lot that night. I know I had many nightmares, but curiously, I've never been able to remember what they were about. In the morning, I heard my dad crying. That's what woke me up. It had barely dawned. It was a cry I had heard from him a few times before, but that I recognized. We went downstairs to see what was happening. Maximo. My Max was lying by the front door, as if he had fallen asleep never to wake again. He had died at some point in the early morning. It was one of the saddest things I've had to experience. It hurt as if they had torn out a piece of my heart. He had been with me since I was a child. He had been a very important part of my life. My dad, now calmer, told me that he had probably held on a bit longer, just to see this new house, to be able to get here with me. He assured me that perhaps the poor thing was already tired, but knew he had to hold on a little longer, that he had to accompany me on this journey. The strangest thing happened in the afternoon, when we started looking for a place nearby to cremate him. When I asked Rafa if Maximo looked normal when he opened the door for him to leave the room, Rafa told me he hadn't opened it, that he was sure it had been me. I told him that I had heard him, that I had woken up but hadn't opened my eyes. I thought it was him because I heard perfectly how the door opened, how the stiff handle that we had promised to oil the night before moved. He told me he was sure it had been me, that he had opened his eyes and seen me opening the door, standing next to it. As if you were covered with a sheet up to your neck. That's how you opened it. But I saw you. And if it wasn't you, a woman got into the house. Although he had tried to joke with that phrase, I told him to be serious, please. I swore to him that I hadn't gotten up, and he changed the subject, thinking I felt guilty for letting Max out. Because if not, maybe we would have heard him whimpering, or maybe he would have fallen asleep between us. But something happened. For some reason, he went downstairs. For some reason, he died at that door. I know my dog was very old, that he had been through a lot, that he was tired, but there was something strange. My dad didn't want to leave me, but he had to return to Chihuahua, so I asked him to drive carefully. I was worried about him leaving at night, but it was a journey he had made hundreds of times, although it had been years since he had done it alone. My dad left us at the house to head out. He calculated he would arrive after midnight, and I think that day more than any other, I asked him to please let me know when he arrived, regardless of the time. I told him to call me, or at least send me a message, to know he had arrived safely, that I would be waiting. Although Maximo had only inhabited it for one night, when we entered the house, we felt a sadness that filled it completely, a loneliness difficult to describe. I looked at his bed, looked at his toys, and I broke down. I collapsed. From the bathroom, I heard Rafa laugh. I heard him mutter, "Ridiculous woman." And I yelled at him, asking how he could say something like that, if my dog meant nothing to him. I hated Rafa at that moment, and suddenly, Rafa came out of the kitchen with tea to calm me down. He asked me what I was referring to, and I told him I was sure I had heard him talking, inside the bathroom, behind our backs. But it wasn't my imagination. It wasn't confusion. I got up to check because indeed I had heard a man's voice coming from there, of a man who was whispering. I started to feel very uncomfortable, very uneasy. And of course I attributed it not only to being in a new place, in a new city, far from my family and friends, but I had just lost that last tie I had to my childhood, to my mother. Besides, there was something very strange, and it was that I felt that in every room, from the shadows, someone was watching me. As if every place in that house that was covered by darkness was the hiding place of something that lurked. I felt my heart racing. The only thing I was waiting for was for my dad to call, but I didn't want to send him messages to see how he was doing, so as not to distract him, so he wouldn't look at his cell phone and something terrible would happen. When the phone rang, I answered it before the first ring ended. "Hello?" I asked, followed by a silence that might have been just seconds, but that seemed eternal to me. I couldn't hear anything on the other end of the line except the distant sound of a running engine. "Daughter, are you okay? Is everything okay there?" My dad's voice sounded strange. He was evidently still on the road and speaking very worried, but with that voice parents make when they want to pretend something happened but don't want to scare you. I told him everything was fine, that I was just worried about him, and I wanted him to get home so I could go to sleep. "Something just happened to me. I had to pull over, but I'm fine. Don't worry. Something very strange happened to me. Let me start the car." Let me get out of here and I'll tell you. I asked him not to drive while talking on the phone, and he put me on speakerphone. I got up so as not to wake Rafa by listening to my conversation. Something crossed my path and something very strange. Something was standing there in the middle of the road, a woman in black, very tall, very thin, all covered up, but I don't know how to say it. Daughter, she looked. A long silence had to pass before my dad could say the following. I know how this sounds, daughter, but it was death. I saw her face. It was death. I stayed talking to my dad until he got home. He was very scared but tried to hide it. He looked for excuses to keep me on the line. He needed it. We hung up only when he entered his house. Rafa had been listening to everything. The silence in the room, in the house, was such that he could hear everything completely. What does he say he saw on the road? He asked me, and still scared about what I was about to say because I have a lot of respect for it. I told him that he had seen death. He got up and sat on the bed. He turned on the light. He told me to come with him and turned on all the lights in the house without telling me anything and scaring me. He started searching everywhere, in every corner, turning on every light in the place. He insisted that I tell him what was going on. I asked him to stop, to explain. He arranged a couch very close to the front door where we had found Max, and told me to come with him, to lie down there with him. I don't know if everything with Max has me very nervous, what you heard, but I feel there's something here. When my friends were waiting for us to unload things, they told me they thought there was already someone in the house. They told me they saw someone peeking through one of the windows, that they even greeted them, but they didn't respond. I told them there was no one, and they didn't want to say anything else. But you saw how they left as soon as they could last night. And earlier, when your dad left, I swear I saw that he had someone with him in the back seat of the truck. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want to scare you. Because I wasn't going to tell him, "Sir, don't leave. I feel like I just saw you carrying a ghost. Forgive me for not telling you. Please forgive me." I feel, community, that if I was so strong, so adult, when we lived through what I'm narrating, it's because I saw two strong, brave men, like Rafa and my dad, break down like children. I heard their voice. I heard their fear. I saw it in their eyes. That's why I had to be strong myself, to survive. But fear was also consuming me. We slept very badly that night. On the street where the house was, it seemed like no one passed by. It was a private road, as I say. There seemed to be no dogs. There were no noises. It seemed like no one lived there. But it was strange because all the cars were in their places. And it wasn't because of the heat that no one was outside. Something that can force people in this city to not go out, because those days the weather was quite mild. Around 9 in the morning, when we were cleaning with the door open, we saw some children walking from the end of the private road, but just as they reached our house, they crossed the street. As soon as they passed, they crossed back and continued walking. We then started to observe carefully. The two houses that bordered ours had sealed their windows. One with wood and the other, noticeably, had patches of drywall maybe, but all the windows that faced us were closed forever. We went to the back of the other street. We were separated by a wall that ran along the entire private road, but right behind us, and only behind us, over the cement wall, they had added a wooden fence that prevented us from seeing beyond. There was something very strange about our house, and the only thing that occurred to me was to go directly to the neighbors under the pretext of introducing ourselves, of saying we would live there. I visited some houses around, however. People greeted me from inside their door. They didn't even say welcome or anything. They answered with monosyllables, waiting for me to leave. It was noticeable. A man about 50 years old who was washing his car didn't have the chance to hide when I approached. When I told him that I wanted to meet the neighbors because we expected to live there for a long time, then he laughed and said very sarcastically, "Right, well." I told him I didn't know why he was reacting that way, that we had just arrived, that it wasn't my intention to offend anyone, that we didn't know the previous inhabitants of the house, and only then did he raise his gaze as if about to say something, but he held back. He lowered it back to his car. However, His wife, I think, was listening from inside their house behind a metal door that didn't allow seeing inside. She called me, but didn't open that door, that barrier between us. "Do you really know nothing about the people who were in that house before?" she asked. I replied that I didn't. I felt she moved closer to the door. She started speaking more quietly. "Look at the marks. They didn't have much time to fix it, so look at the marks. Start with the ones above your door at the entrance. Horrible things happened in that house. Horrible people lived in that house. But the worst of all is what happened when the house was empty, when all the entrances were sealed by the prosecutor's office." "What happened in my house? Who lived there?" I asked, but I only heard the neighbors breathing, and how she closed an interior wooden door to leave me there alone. I quickly went to Rafa and asked him if he knew, and he said no, that they hadn't told him anything strange about the house, that one of his friends had gone with the agent just to verify that it had everything the ad said and that it was in good condition. But we looked for the marks first, the ones that were on the main facade. The house had undergone a complete repair, but there were still small marks that if you scratched a little you could notice had been resigned. I can't be sure, but we're almost certain they were bullet marks. We tried to sleep. We tried not to think. There would be time to continue investigating the next day. However, we weren't going to have a peaceful night. I was awakened in the early morning by the sound Maximo made when he wanted me to open the door. For a moment, I completely forgot where I was. I forgot that Max was no longer with me. I told him to wait there. When I opened my eyes and got up, I immediately realized where I was, that Maximo was no longer there. "Don't get up," I heard Rafa's voice whispering. "Go back to sleep. Close your eyes. Don't turn to look at the door. Please, don't turn to look at the door." I didn't understand what he meant, but I discreetly lay down. I heard Rafa's breathing. I heard that he was crying. He was crying from fear. "What's wrong? What happened? Tell me what's wrong." Rafa couldn't answer me. I realized he was trembling. The door was behind me, and I don't know how to explain that. Although I could see how scared he was, I couldn't resist the curiosity to turn around. Perhaps curiosity isn't even the right word, because there was nothing playful about it. There was only fear. My heart was racing. After pretending to be asleep for a few minutes, I turned around. Rafa tried to stop me, but I didn't listen. I ignored him. I turned toward the door with my eyes closed, but gathered the courage to open them, to see what was at the door. What had Rafa so frightened? I opened my eyes slightly. The first thing I noticed was that the door was slightly open. We hadn't left it that way. We had gone to sleep so scared that we had checked several times to make sure it was very well closed. Rafa had done it. All the doors in that house were solid wood, not hollow and light like interior doors usually are. Here they were all heavy. They all had very strong locks, but there it was, open now. And when my eyes adjusted to the darkness, when I could make out more details, I saw her peering in without moving, as if she were just a figure standing there, right outside our room. It's the most terrifying face I've ever seen in my life. The face of a woman who seemed to have hair only on the left side of her head, near her ear. A woman who was smiling without teeth. Or at least that's what it looked like. A smile that was barely visible. And her eyes. The worst were her eyes. They stretched upward, like when you pull your forehead, like when you're getting dressed and a piece of clothing stretches them and they elongate like drops. I can swear to you that one of her eyes stretched up to her forehead. My scream was so piercing that I hurt my throat. It was so loud that I'm completely sure I woke up half of the private community. But nobody did anything. There wasn't a single voice, a single person asking if everything was okay. There wasn't a light that turned on, or someone looking out their window. Rafa and I jumped as best we could from the balcony and slept by the door, waiting a while until we decided to go back in. Luckily, I had left my keys in the car. Rafa confessed to me that he had already seen that woman, but in the empty room, before we went to sleep. When he went upstairs, when I was waiting for him in our room, he saw her and first thought it was me, because she was standing in the middle of that room, looking toward the window, toward nothing. toward that wooden fence they had built in the house behind, perhaps precisely to not see her, or so she wouldn't see toward it. That's why he insisted so much on checking the door, on making sure it was closed. He was terrified, but he was trying to hide it to not upset me. 2 nights. We lasted 2 nights there, and apparently less than the previous family that had arrived at that house. But at least we were saved because Rafa used the place as storage for the rest of the contract. And when he had to go to the place, he just had to drop things off. When his 2 friends, now business partners, were going with him, they started gaining the trust of the people around, of the neighbors. That's when they finally told him the truth. The house had been a refuge for a couple of drug traffickers. They were very bad people who knew that the neighbors knew what they did for a living, but they weren't worried, and people didn't report them. Who were they going to report them to if patrol cars would occasionally come to greet them, exchange some comments, and then leave them there? The people, the neighbors, couldn't do anything. They tried to ignore it. But the worst was when these people started performing rituals. Terrible things. Always with open doors, literally with the doors open. There was something satanic there, and they wanted everyone to know it. They wanted everyone to be afraid. Whatever was there, it fed on that, on the fear of the people around. Finally, they used that place to hide someone. Apparently, a kidnapping victim. They were awakened by gunshots one morning and officers and soldiers knocking on house doors asking people to get out of there. Those who could, and those who were at the back, asking them to take shelter, to hide in a corner of the house. That siege lasted quite a while until the 2 criminals surrendered. But the curious thing is that the police, the soldiers, claimed to have seen someone else in the window, a 3rd subject who didn't appear anywhere. At least that's what they say. But for the victim they had there, it had been too late. That's all they told us. And this was one of those things that only become known through Facebook pages, through WhatsApp groups, these things that never make it to the news. In that house, 3 entities had remained. They say, once they took those criminals away from there, one was the woman with the stretched eyes, the one I saw, and a very tall one in black that had half its face like a skull. From the nose up, that entity, that woman left, for some reason, with my father, to Chihuahua. But that's a story for another time. I just ask you that if you know of a place where criminal acts of this caliber occur, where such evil things are worshipped, please, I ask you to get away as soon as you can. Even if you lose everything, even if you leave everything behind, even if you have to abandon your house. If you saw Rafa and me, you would realize, like our acquaintances do, who wonder how we aged 10 years in 2 nights.